The moment Matilda Mercer rode up to Isaac Haskins and asked him plain as sunrise if he would marry her, his hands went slack on the reins, and his bay gelding, Copper, sidled 2 full steps sideways before Isaac grabbed hold of himself and the horse both. And even then his boot slipped clean out of the left stirrup, and he had to lurch forward against Copper's neck just to keep his seat, which, for a man who had spent the better part of 2 years rehearsing every word he might ever say to that woman, was about as undignified a moment as the good Lord had ever seen fit to arrange. That was the spring of 1878, out on the wide flat country east of Abilene, Kansas, where the grass had just turned green enough to give a man hope, and the wind came sweeping down from the north with enough cold still threaded through it to remind him that hope was always a little premature in that part of the world. The Mercer homestead sat on 160 acres of that grass, deeded under the Homestead Act by Matilda's late father, Clarence Mercer, who had come west from Ohio in 1872 with a wagon full of seed corn and a stubborn conviction that the plains owed him a living. Clarence had broken the sod, built the house, and then died of a fever in the autumn of 1876, leaving the land and a modest herd of shorthorn cattle to his daughter, who was 22 years old at the time and had not a single living relative within 500 miles. Matilda had kept the place running by sheer force of character, which was considerable. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself as though she were, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat when she worked and let fall loose around her shoulders in the evenings when she thought no one was watching. Her eyes were the particular shade of green that you only ever seem to find in people who know their own minds absolutely, and her hands, though roughened by work, moved with a precision that suggested she had once been taught finer things. She could ride, she could rope, she could shoot well enough to keep the coyotes honest, and she ran her small ranch with a ledger book and a calendar that she marked each day with quiet, determined strokes. Isaac Haskins had come to the Mercer place in the spring of 1876, a few months before Clarence died. He was 26 at the time, which made him 4 years older than Matilda, and he had arrived with a saddle roll, a Henry rifle, a good rope, and not much else beyond a reputation among the cattlemen of central Kansas for being the kind of hand who showed up on time, worked without being told twice, and never started trouble though he was perfectly equipped to finish it. He stood just over 6 feet, lean through the shoulders but solid in a way that suggested the leanness was working muscle rather than deprivation, with dark hair that curled a little at the collar when it grew out, and gray eyes that people tended to remember after they had forgotten everything else about the conversation. Clarence Mercer had hired him on the spot after watching him handle a spooked horse for 30 seconds in the yard, and Isaac had been working that land ever since, sleeping in the small bunkhouse that Clarence had built against the south wall of the barn, eating supper most nights at the kitchen table, and doing the work of 2 men without complaint. When Clarence died, Isaac had stayed. There was never a formal conversation about it. He simply kept doing what he had been doing, and Matilda kept paying him his monthly wage, and that was that. The town of Ridgeton, which was the nearest settlement of any real consequence, was 7 miles west along a wagon road that turned to soup in the rain, and it had the usual assortment of dry goods stores, a livery, 2 saloons, a church that was served by a circuit preacher every 3rd Sunday, and enough people to generate the usual volume of small-town observation and opinion. The opinion of Ridgeton regarding Matilda Mercer was that she was brave and capable and more than a little stubborn, and the opinion of Ridgeton regarding Isaac Haskins was that he was steady and decent and probably in love with his employer, though nobody had ever heard him say so. He had not said so. That was the particular difficulty, and it had been growing for 2 full years. It had started in a small way, the way these things always do, with nothing more dramatic than the fact of her. He had worked for Clarence for a few months before the old man died, and in that time Matilda had been present at the edges of his days, bringing water out to the field, discussing the cattle numbers with her father at supper, reading in the evenings by the lamp. He had noticed her the way a man notices things that are good and well-made and not his to touch, with appreciation kept carefully at a respectful distance. But then Clarence was gone and the distance closed, not physically but in every other way. Because when Matilda was running that ranch alone, she needed a partner in it, someone to talk through decisions with, someone to tell her honestly when she was wrong, someone who would be there at 4 in the morning when a heifer was struggling, and again at 10 at night when the numbers in the ledger refused to balance. And Isaac was there. He was always there. And somewhere in the long months of that first winter after Clarence's death, in the conversations around the kitchen table about whether to sell the southeast pasture or hold it, in the cold mornings when they worked side by side without speaking, because both of them understood exactly what needed doing, in the evenings when she laughed at something unexpected, and the sound of it moved through him like wind through tall grass, he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Matilda Mercer. And then he had done nothing about it. There were reasons, and he had rehearsed them all. She was his employer. He was a hired hand with no land and no house and wages that, while honest, were not the foundation upon which a man proposed building a life with a woman. He was not sure that what he felt was visible or welcome or anything other than a private inconvenience he should manage quietly. He was not, in his own estimation, entirely good enough, which was not self-pity but arithmetic. She had 160 acres, and he had a saddle and a good horse, and the math did not favor the gesture. And so he had stayed silent. He had stayed at work. He had been reliable and professional and decent, and he had watched her through 2 full cycles of seasons with a feeling in his chest that had no outlet and no resolution, and that he had learned to carry the way you learn to carry a stone in your boot, always aware of it, always accommodating it, never quite free of it. He had come close once. It was the previous autumn, October of 1877, after a hard day of gathering cattle before a storm. They had worked 12 hours straight and come back in wet and tired, and she had made coffee and they sat at the table, and she had looked up at him over her cup with those green eyes and said, "I don't know what I would do without you, Isaac." And his heart had done something violent and inconvenient in his chest, and he had opened his mouth and then said, "The storm will pass by morning, most likely," which was not what he had intended and also not particularly relevant to what she had said. And she had looked at him for a second with an expression he could not quite read, and then looked back at her coffee, and the moment had passed. He had replayed that moment approximately 400 times since. The spring of 1878 began with practical concerns, as all springs do on working ranches. There were fences to repair after the winter, a section of the south pasture that had flooded and needed to be drained before it would be useful, and a question about the cattle market that was pressing. The previous year's prices had been reasonable but not exceptional, and Matilda had been turning over the idea of selling part of the herd early, before the big drives out of Texas flooded the market at Abilene, which was about 30 miles west of Ridgeton and still functioning as a cattle shipping point, though its great days were behind it, and the railhead at Dodge City was drawing more traffic now. She had raised the question at supper one evening in early April, spreading the ledger open on the table between them, her finger tracing the columns. Isaac had leaned in to look, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and something floral from her hair, and he had focused very deliberately on the numbers. "If we sell 20 head by the end of April," he said, "before the Texas herds come through you get better per head price, but you lose the weight they'll put on grazing through May." "I've been thinking the same," she said. "The question is whether the price difference covers the weight difference." "It does this year," Isaac said. "The drives are running heavy. I heard it from Dunbar when I was in Ridgeton last week. 3 outfits out of South Texas, bigger than last year. Abilene market'll be soft by June." She nodded slowly, pulling the ledger toward her. "Then we sell the 20. I want to keep the 4 youngest heifers and the bull for building the herd next year." "That's sound," he said. "Will you cut them out tomorrow?" "Already got an eye on which ones," he said. She smiled and he looked at the lamp instead. That was how their days went. Efficient, cooperative, honest about the work and entirely dishonest about everything else, or at least Isaac was. He had spent enough time wondering whether she felt anything in return to have driven himself halfway to madness, but the ambiguity protected him. As long as he did not speak, he could not be refused, and being refused was the one thing he believed he could not absorb cleanly. The ranch mattered. The work mattered. Her good opinion of him as a reliable man mattered. He was not willing to risk those things on the chance of something more. The cattle sale happened on the 23rd of April. Isaac drove the 20 head into Abilene along with Matilda, who rode beside the small herd on her gray mare, a capable animal she called Sunday, and they sold at a price that made her smile in the lean, satisfied way she had when something worked out as planned. They ate at a small restaurant on Cedar Street afterward, a real table with a cloth on it, which felt slightly formal after their usual supper table with its ledger books and harness catalogs, and she ordered coffee and a slice of dried apple pie, and he had the beef stew, and they talked about the ranch and about a horse fair in Ellsworth the following month and about nothing in particular, and it was, by Isaac's private accounting, one of the best evenings of the past 2 years. Because they were off the ranch and out in the world, and it felt, only to him, slightly like something other than what it was. On the ride back in the last of the April light, she said, "Do you ever think about having your own place, Isaac?" He looked at her sidelong. "Sometimes," he said. "What kind of place?" He was quiet for a moment. Copper plodded along steadily. "Cattle mostly," he said at last. "Some horses, not too big, enough to be manageable with a couple of good hands." "Where?" "Don't know exactly," he said. "Somewhere the grass is good, east of here maybe, or north. Country like this." He paused. "Why do you ask?" She was looking forward at the road. "Just wondering," she said, and the tone of it was one he had not heard before and could not quite identify. And then Copper shied at a jackrabbit in the grass and the moment broke, and they rode the rest of the way in companionable silence as the stars came out. He thought about that question for several days afterward. In early May, a problem arrived in the form of a man named Denton Price. Price was not a dangerous man in the violent sense. He was a land speculator from Wichita who had been buying up homestead claims along the creek drainage east of Ridgeton, and he had developed an interest in the Mercer property because the creek that ran through the northeast corner of it made it considerably more valuable than the dry sections on either side. He had called at the ranch twice already, in the fall and again in February, each time with a written offer that Matilda had declined politely but without equivocation. He came again on a Tuesday in early May, arriving in a buggy with a younger man who was apparently his clerk, and Matilda met him in the yard with the same straight-backed composure she brought to everything. Isaac was working on the fence along the near pasture and had a clear view of the interaction from 50 yards away. He could not hear the conversation, but he watched Price's body language with professional attention, and he stayed where he was but did not resume work. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes. At the end of it, Price opened a leather case and produced a document which Matilda looked at and then handed back. She shook her head. Price spoke again, and whatever he said made her jaw set in the particular way it did when she was keeping her temper. She said something brief. Price said something longer. She pointed at the road. Price looked at Isaac for the first time, held the look for a moment, and then got back in his buggy and drove away. Isaac walked over. "He go up in price?" he asked. 20%, she said. "I told him the place isn't for sale at any price. He'll be back. I know it." She was looking at the road where the dust of Price's buggy was still settling. "He said something this time I didn't like." "What did he say?" "He said that a woman managing a property like this alone was always going to be at a disadvantage, and that eventually circumstances would persuade me to see reason. She said it flatly, without particular heat, which meant the heat was all on the inside. He said circumstances in a way that I think was meant to be a threat. Isaac's jaw tightened. What kind of circumstances? He wasn't specific. She turned and looked at him. I want to be clear with you about something, Isaac. I'm not frightened of Denton Price, but I'm not naive either. If he starts interfering with the cattle or the water or anything else on this property, I need you to tell me the moment you see it, not protect me from knowing about it. Always have, he said. I know, I just wanted to say it out loud. He nodded. Matilda, he said her name rarely. He was always careful about how often he said it. This place is yours. You hold the deed and you've worked every inch of it. Nobody gets to threaten you out of it. She looked at him with the full weight of those green eyes, and something in her expression shifted very briefly, like a door opening just a fraction before it steadied. Thank you, she said, and went back to the house. He stood in the yard for a moment in the warm May sun and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that if he did not say something soon the opportunity was going to pass him entirely, because a woman like Matilda Mercer was not going to remain alone indefinitely, and the thought of someone else claiming the right to stand in that yard with her was approximately the worst thought he was capable of having. He still said nothing. The trouble from Price came indirectly, as promised. The following week, 2 of the shorthorns in the east pasture turned up lame, and upon examination Isaac found their hooves had been treated with something caustic that he could not identify precisely, but which had the effect of making them unable to walk properly. He told Matilda immediately, as agreed. She looked at the cattle with steady eyes and then said, "Can they recover?" "Probably," he said. "With care, maybe 6 weeks. Then we care for them." She straightened up. "I'm going to talk to Sheriff Briggs in Ridgeton. I'll come with you. I can manage a conversation with the sheriff." "I know you can," he said. "I want to come." She looked at him. "All right," she said. Sheriff Eli Briggs was a practical man of 50 who had been keeping the peace in Ridgeton and the surrounding country since 1873, and he listened to Matilda's account with attention and took notes in a small book, and said he was aware of Denton Price's business methods, and that he would pay a call on Mr. Price and make certain inquiries. He also said that he could not prove anything without evidence and suggested that if anything further happened on the Mercer property, they document it carefully. On the way back, Matilda said, "Do you believe Briggs will actually do something?" "He's a fair man," Isaac said. "Whether Price does anything to prove is a different question." "The cattle will recover," she said, as if settling that point in her own mind. "Price can harass all he likes. He can't make me sell." "No," Isaac agreed. They rode in silence for a mile. The spring grass was very green and the sky above the plains was enormous and blue, with clouds building in the west that might or might not amount to anything by evening. A meadowlark sang from a fence post as they passed, clear and bright, and the sound of it in the open air felt like something generous. "My father used to say," Matilda said, "that the plains tested everybody and kept only the ones who deserved to stay." "He was right," Isaac said. She glanced at him. "He liked you very much, you know. He told me so not long before he died. He said that Haskins is the kind of man you can count on in the dark." Isaac looked at the road ahead. Something moved in his chest that he had no word for. "He was a good man," he said. "He was," she agreed, and her voice was quiet in the way it got when she was thinking about her father. "I miss him still, but I think the place would please him how it's running." "It would," Isaac said with certainty. She nodded, satisfied with that, and they rode on. The lame cattle recovered, just as Isaac had predicted, over the course of the following weeks. He worked them carefully, moving them to a clean, dry pen near the barn, treating the hooves twice daily with a poultice the old veterinary in Ridgeton had recommended. Matilda helped with the morning treatments before her other work, and they fell into the rhythm of it without discussion, the way they fell into most things. There was a companionship in it that Isaac felt as a particular kind of pain, because it was so exactly what he wanted and so far from what he had acknowledged wanting, and the distance between those two things had begun to feel like a very long walk across very rough ground. There were a couple of other hands who came through during the busy spring season. A young man named Dale Cutter worked a few weeks helping with the fencing and the herd management, and an older cowhand named Pete Whalen, who had worked cattle drives out of Texas for 15 years, and who had settled into day work now that his knees had opinions about long days in the saddle. Both men were decent and competent, and both, in the way of all men who spent any time near Matilda Mercer, developed an obvious appreciation for their employer. Dale Cutter in particular was 20 years old, cheerful, broad-shouldered, and had a habit of finding reasons to be wherever Matilda was working. Isaac watched this with a feeling that he recognized, after honest inspection, as jealousy, and then felt irritated at himself for feeling it, because he had no claim and had chosen to have no claim, and had no one to blame for the lack of a claim but himself. On a Thursday afternoon in late May, he was working alone near the barn when Dale Cutter walked over from the north fence line and stopped beside him with what was recognizably the attitude of a young man working up to something. "She's something, isn't she?" Cutter said, watching Matilda cross the yard toward the chicken coop with a bucket. Isaac did not look up from the harness he was mending. "She's a fine rancher," he said. "I was thinking of asking her to the church social," Cutter said. "Third Sunday the preacher's coming through. There's usually a supper after." Isaac set the harness down and looked at him. Cutter was not a bad young man. He was just young and cheerful and had no idea what he was standing in the middle of. "That's your business," Isaac said. "You don't think it'd go over?" "I don't have an opinion about it," Isaac said, which was the largest lie he had told in several years. Cutter nodded and went back to his fence work. Isaac picked up the harness again and sat with his hands still for a moment. The church social was on the third Sunday of June, which was 3 weeks away. That night at supper, after Pete Whalen and Dale Cutter had gone to the bunkhouse, Isaac sat across the kitchen table from Matilda while she worked on the ledger, and he sharpened a knife and tried to think of something to say that was not what he actually wanted to say. The lamp burned between them with its familiar warm light. Outside, the plains were quiet under a sky full of stars. A nightjar called somewhere near the creek. "Cutter's going to ask you to the church social," he said before he had entirely decided to say it. She did not look up from the ledger. "Is he?" He said as much this afternoon. She turned a page. "How old is he?" 20, Isaac said. 21, maybe." "He's a good worker," she said. "He is," Isaac agreed, which cost him something. She looked up then and studied him for a moment with those green eyes in the lamplight, and he looked back at her and felt the full weight of 2 years of silence sitting on his chest like a stone. "Is that all you wanted to say?" she said. "Yes," he said, which was the second largest lie he had told in several years. She went back to the ledger. "The coffee's still hot," she said. He poured himself another cup and sat back down, and they spent another hour at the table in the lamp's light, while the Kansas night settled around the house. And he thought that if this were a different man's story, this would be the moment he finally spoke. But it was his story, and he was the man he was, and he drank his coffee and said nothing. And eventually she closed the ledger and said good night and went upstairs, and he walked out to the bunkhouse under the stars and stood in the yard for a while listening to the nightjar and feeling like the world's largest fool. He slept badly and was up before dawn working on the south pasture drainage ditch, which needed several more days of work before it would function properly. The physical labor was good. It did not solve anything, but it occupied the body, and the body's occupation allowed the mind a certain respite from its own operations, and by mid-morning he had accomplished a useful amount and was feeling almost reasonable. Which was when Matilda came across the field toward him on Sunday, moving at an easy canter that she shifted to a walk as she approached. She pulled up 10 feet away and dismounted in the fluid way she had, and Sunday dropped her head to graze. "I need your opinion on something," she said. "All right," he said, leaning on his shovel. "Price has put in a formal complaint with the county land office," she said, "claiming that my father's original survey was incorrect and that the northeast corner of this property actually falls on a section that was never legally transferred." She held out a paper, which Isaac took and read carefully. It was a letter from the county land office in Salina, informing her that a challenge had been filed and that she would need to provide documentation of the original survey within 30 days. "That's nonsense," Isaac said. "I know it's nonsense," she said. "But I need to prove it's nonsense to a county clerk in Salina, which means I need to find my father's original survey records and possibly hire a surveyor to verify the line." She paused. Briggs was right about documenting things. Price is trying a different avenue. "He can't win on the merits," Isaac said. "Your father homesteaded that land legally. The deed is recorded." "The deed is recorded, but the survey plat is in a box in the house somewhere," she said. "I haven't gone through all my father's papers thoroughly. There's a box of documents I haven't had the heart to open since he died." He heard the slight change in her voice on those last words and looked at her. She was not a woman who showed grief easily, but it was there. "We'll find the documents," he said. "Tonight, if you like, I'll help you look." She nodded. "I'd appreciate that." They found the box that evening after supper, a wooden crate under the bed in the room that had been Clarence Mercer's, and they sat on the floor of that room together with the lamp between them, going through paper after paper, certificates and correspondence and a Bible with family records in the front, and old letters from Ohio that Matilda read with a careful face. And eventually, toward the bottom of the box, the original survey plat in its proper condition, signed by the surveyor and dated 1872, with every corner stake clearly documented and the creek boundary precisely mapped. "There it is," Isaac said, and felt her relief from where he sat, felt it the way you feel warmth from a fire. "Thank goodness for thorough fathers," she said softly. "Clarence was thorough in everything," Isaac said. She looked at the survey document for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "I talk to him sometimes. Is that strange?" "No," Isaac said. "I stand out on the north pasture where we used to look at the cattle together, and I tell him how things are going." She paused. "I told him last fall that I didn't know how I would have managed without you. I think he already knew that, wherever he is." Isaac looked at her profile in the lamplight, at the line of her jaw and the curve of her mouth, and the way the light caught in her hair, and the 2 years of silence pressed against the inside of his ribs with a force that was nearly physical. He said nothing. They sent the survey documents to Salina with a covering letter the following week, and Sheriff Briggs, who had by this time clearly developed a personal objection to Denton Price's methods, added his own letter confirming the legitimacy of the Mercer claim. The county land office dismissed the challenge 3 weeks later, and Denton Price, faced with the failure of his indirect approach, appears to have redirected his acquisitive energy elsewhere because his buggy did not come down the Mercer Road again. June arrived. The grass was tall and the cattle were fat on it, and the 2 that had been lamed were fully recovered and running with the herd. Dale Cutter had, apparently, approached Matilda about the church social, because Isaac saw them speaking alone in the yard one afternoon with the aspect of a conversation that was slightly more personal than the usual work discussions, and he went to work on the horses' feet with a rasping efficiency that probably surprised the horses. He did not ask about it that evening. He talked about the east fence line, which needed new posts in 2 places, and about a horse he had been watching at the Ridgeton livery that had the look of a good cutting horse, and about the possibility of rain in the next few days based on the sky and the way the cattle were moving. She answered all of these topics and added her own observations, and at no point mentioned the church social or Dale Cutter. And eventually Isaac said good night and went to the bunkhouse and stood in the dark for a while, feeling like a man who was watching his own life from a considerable distance. The 3rd Sunday of June came, and the circuit preacher came with it, and there was a service in the small church on the edge of Ridgeton, and afterward the congregation spread blankets and tables in the churchyard, and produced the kind of food that appears only when the women of a community have had 3 weeks to plan. Isaac wore his good shirt, which he had washed and pressed the day before, and he stood at the edge of things in the way he always did in social situations, comfortable enough but not seeking the center. He watched Dale Cutter ride in with evident enthusiasm, and he watched Matilda arrive on Sunday with the same composure she brought everywhere. She wore a blue dress that he had not seen before. She must have made it or had it made at the dry goods store that stocked fabric, because he knew her wardrobe and this was not in it. And her hair was down and pinned back at the sides, and she looked, by any objective measure, remarkable. Cutter found her almost immediately. Isaac watched them talk and found something useful to do at the far end of the churchyard, which involved admiring a very ordinary fence post for rather longer than it deserved. Pete Whalen appeared at his elbow, eating a piece of cold cornbread. "You know," Pete said, with the philosophical manner of a man who had been watching other people's complications for 50 years, if a man stares at a fence post long enough, people start to wonder what's wrong with the post. "Nothing's wrong with it," Isaac said. "Good post," Pete agreed. "Solid. Just interesting that you picked this particular post to study when there's a much more interesting view in the other direction." "Pete," Isaac said. "I'm just saying," Pete said, "that a man can wait so long to say something that the saying becomes harder and not easier, and if that man is also a decent human being with 2 good eyes in his head, he might want to consider that waiting has its own consequences." "You're the most opinionated fence post inspector I've ever met," Isaac said. Pete smiled and walked away. Cutter, as it turned out, did not manage to convert the social into anything promising from his perspective. He and Matilda spoke pleasantly for a while and ate supper near each other. But Matilda's manner, while perfectly friendly, was not warmer than it was with the half-dozen other people she spoke with that afternoon. And by the time the social wound down in the late afternoon, Cutter looked like a young man who had received a cordial but clear answer without a single word having been exchanged to that effect. He was still cheerful because he was essentially a cheerful person, and he stayed on through the end of June, but his attentions redrew themselves to their proper professional dimension. Isaac noticed all of this. He did not permit himself to feel too much about it, because the fact of Cutter's non-success did not actually change his own situation by a single inch. The 4th of July brought a celebration in Ridgeton that was modest by some standards but enthusiastic by the community's own, with a fireworks display organized by the hardware merchant and a dance in the street that went on until well past midnight. It was a warm night, clear and bright with stars, and the whole valley seemed to have turned out for it. Isaac danced twice, once with the Methodist minister's wife because it would have been impolite not to, and once with the hardware merchant's daughter because she asked and refusal would have been unkind. And he watched Matilda dance 3 times, once with old Mr. Parrott, who ran the feed store and was approximately 70 and harmless, once with a young man from the Donnelly outfit north of town who was confident and handsome in the way of young men who know it, and once with Sheriff Briggs, who danced with everything he had, which was surprisingly good footwork for a man his size. Then the music changed to something slower, and the floor thinned, and Matilda was standing at the edge of the dance floor near the lamp post, and she looked across the crowd and found him where he stood, and her eyes met his with a directness that he felt all the way down to the ground. He walked toward her. He was not entirely sure he decided to. It felt more like the decision had been made at some prior point, and he was only now catching up with it. He stopped in front of her. The music was slow, and the night was warm, and the lamplight made everything amber and gold. "Dance with me," he said. She looked up at him for a moment that lasted, by his internal counting, approximately 1 full geological era. "I was wondering when you'd ask," she said. They danced. She was a better dancer than he was, but not by enough to matter, and they fit together in the physical way of people whose bodies have learned each other through 2 years of shared work, the instinctive adjustments, the easy weight of her hand in his. He did not say anything meaningful. He could not find the words, and the music was not the right container for them, and there were 40 people around them in the street. But he held her with more honesty than he had ever permitted himself. Not the careful distance of an employee and employer, but the real distance of 2 people who were paying attention to each other. and she did not create any additional space between them, and the song went on for what felt like a generous amount of time. And when it ended, they stood still for just one extra beat before stepping apart. "Thank you," she said. "Yes," he said, which was not particularly informative but was all he had. On the ride home, which they made together because that was the natural thing, the Kansas night was deep and warm and full of the sound of insects and the distant conversation of a creek, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence between them was a different quality of silence from usual. It had weight in it, and warmth, and the suggestion of things pending. Isaac was composing sentences in his head. Extensive, careful, honest sentences about what he felt and what he wanted, and what he understood he might be risking by saying it. He arranged and rearranged them. He found the right order for 2 miles and then lost it and found it again. They turned down the road toward the ranch, and the dark shape of the house came up against the stars, and she said, "Good night, Isaac," when they reached the yard and went inside, and he stood with the horses and thought that he had been very close to something tonight and had still somehow not reached it. "Tomorrow," he told Copper. "Tomorrow I say it." Copper expressed no opinion. He did not say it tomorrow, or the next day. A week passed. The summer grew heavy and hot, the way Kansas summers do, with a weight to the air and a shimmer off the flat ground, and the cattle drifting toward the creek in the heat of the day. The work was constant. There was always something more immediate demanding attention, always a practical reason to defer the personal thing, and he deferred it with the practiced ease of a man who had been deferring it for 2 years, and had the habit well established. And then came the morning of July 19, 1878, which was a Friday, and which Isaac Haskins would remember with extreme specificity for the rest of his life. He was riding Copper along the north fence line, checking the wire for damage after a section of it had been pushed down by cattle the previous day. It was about 9 in the morning, already warm, the sky a pure flat blue. The grass was tall enough to hide the ground between the fence posts, and he was moving at a walk, examining the wire, his hat low against the sun. He heard Sunday before he saw her the particular cadence of that gray mare's hooves, which he knew as well as he knew anything. He did not turn his head immediately. He was focused on a section of wire that had pulled loose from its staple. He heard her pull up behind him and slightly to the right. He said without looking, "Wires pulled loose here." "I'll need to come back with the pliers," she said. "Isaac." Something in the way she said his name made him still. Just his name, one word, and it was different from every other time she had said it in 2 years. It had a specific quality of intention in it, an arrival, as though she had been traveling toward this for a while and had finally come to it. He turned Copper to face her. Sunday stood about 15 feet away, and Matilda sat straight in the saddle with her hat pushed back slightly off her face, and she was looking at him with an expression that he had never seen from her before, and that he could not immediately categorize, because it was too straightforward, too unguarded, too lacking in the professional distance that had been the defining feature of the space between them for 2 years. She said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," he said. His voice came out steady, which he was grateful for. She was quiet for exactly 1 breath. Then she said, "Will you marry me?" Isaac's hands went slack. Copper felt the change in his rider and shifted his hindquarters, stepped sideways. Isaac did not correct him because his attention had been entirely removed from the physical management of the horse, by the fact that Matilda Mercer had just asked him to marry her, and he was processing this fact with a machinery that was running somewhat slowly, due to what could only be described as a comprehensive system shock. And Copper stepped again, and Isaac lurched forward and grabbed the horse's neck with both arms, and his left boot came completely free of the stirrup, and he hung there for a moment against the horse's neck, his hat knocked sideways, before he got his balance and sat back upright. Copper settled. Isaac straightened his hat. He was, by any assessment, not handling this with the dignity he would have preferred. Matilda had both hands pressed over her mouth, and her eyes were very bright, and she was clearly doing an extraordinary job of not laughing at him because the brightness of her eyes had that quality. "Sorry," she said from behind her hands, and she was most definitely trying not to laugh. "I'm fine," he said. "The horse, I can see what happened," she said. He took a breath. He was extremely aware of his own face, which he suspected was doing several things at once. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her hands came down from her mouth, and she was very nearly smiling and very nearly something else entirely, something that was watching him with the full seriousness of a woman who has asked a real question and is waiting with her whole self for the answer. "You're asking me," he said. "I am," she said. He needed to be absolutely certain. "You are asking me." "Isaac," she said, with a gentleness that he thought might take his remaining composure entirely apart. "I am asking you." He looked at her for one more moment, at her face in the morning sun, at those green eyes and that straight-backed composure that was not quite hiding the vulnerability of the question she had just put out into the Kansas air between them, and the 2 years of silence cracked open from the inside cleanly like ice on a spring river. "Yes," he said. Her face did something he had never seen it do. It opened. Not a smile, or not only a smile, but a full and unmistakable opening, as though she had been holding something carefully at bay and had now set it down. And what was left was her, entirely, looking at him with 2 years' worth of her own weighted feeling behind her eyes. "Yes," he said again more firmly, because once was not sufficient and he had been saying nothing for 2 years and he had a great deal of ground to make up. "Yes, Matilda, I will marry you. I would have asked you myself 6 months ago or a year ago," or he stopped. "I should have asked you a long time ago. I wanted to. I didn't," he ran a hand over his face. "I thought I wasn't the right man to ask." She had walked Sunday forward while he was talking, and now the two horses were standing side by side, and she was close enough that he could see the slight brightness in her eyes that was something more than amusement. "I know," she said. "That's why I asked you." He stared at her. "You knew I wanted to." "Isaac," she said, with enormous patience, "you have been in love with me for at least a year that I can identify with certainty, and I have been sitting at that kitchen table every evening watching you not say it, and it became quite clear to me that you were never going to say it. And since I happen to feel the same way, and I also happen to be a woman who believes in handling a situation directly when the indirect approach has failed comprehensively, here we are." She paused. "Here we are," she said again, softer. "He sat with this. He sat with all of it. How long?" he asked. "How long have I felt this way?" "Yes." She considered it with the honest precision she brought to ledger books. "I think," she said carefully, "the winter after my father died, I began to understand what you were to me, and I spent a considerable amount of time expecting you to say something, and then I decided that if you weren't going to, I would." She looked at him steadily. "I am not willing to wait another winter, Isaac. I'm not willing to keep sitting at that table with a man I love and have the conversation be about fence posts and cattle prices." The word love arrived in the air between them with the solid reality of something that had always been there and been named only now. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, which was warm from the morning sun and familiar and exactly right, and she looked down at his hand over hers and then back at him. "I love you," he said. He had wanted to say it for 2 years, and saying it now was the simplest and most obvious thing in the world, and he could not entirely account for the amount of time it had taken him to get here. "I know," she said again and smiled, and the smile was so complete and unguarded that he had to look away for a second at the wide Kansas sky because the directness of it was almost too much. "I should have," he started. "Stop apologizing for the silence," she said. "It's done. You're here now." "I'm here," he agreed. She squeezed his hand. "Come have coffee," she said. "We have things to discuss." They rode back to the ranch side by side, Sunday and Copper moving easily together in the warm morning, and Isaac thought that the world looked different from inside a yes than it had from inside 2 years of unsaid things. The grass was the same grass, the sky the same sky, The house, the same house at the end of the road, but he was moving toward it differently, and she was riding beside him differently, and the difference was considerable. They tied the horses and went inside, and she made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table that had been the stage for 2 years of careful, dishonest evenings, and now they sat there and talked honestly, which was simultaneously more comfortable and more electric than anything that had come before. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I've been setting money aside," he said. "For the past year and a half. Not much, I know the wages aren't, Isaac. Let me say it," he said. "I've got $112 set aside. I know that's not the same as a man coming to you with land of his own, and I know this is your ranch and your deed, and I'm not asking for any part of it to be transferred, Isaac," she said more firmly. He stopped. "This is our ranch," she said. "If you're willing to be my husband, you're half of this, and that's the only way I want it. The land stays in the Mercer name because that's the law and I know it, but I don't care about the law's version of things. I care about the honest version." She put her coffee cup down. "I've been running this place for 2 years because I had no choice and because it was mine to run. But I've also been running it with you because you've been half of every decision I've made since my father died. I'm not offering you a job, Isaac. I'm asking you to be my partner in every meaning of the word." He looked at her for a long time. "Your father would approve," he said finally. "He would be extremely smug about it," she said with a small, private smile. "He liked you from the very beginning. He always said you were here for a reason." "Clarence was often right," Isaac said. "He was," she agreed. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "We should go to Ridgeton this week. The preacher is due at the end of July on his circuit. I would like to be married before August." He blinked. "That's 3 weeks. Is that a problem?" He thought about it. 3 weeks against 2 years of silence. "No," he said. "That's not a problem at all." They told Pete Whalen and Dale Cutter at midday when the hands came in for the noon meal. Pete nodded with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular piece of news and is gratified but not surprised to receive it. Dale Cutter shook Isaac's hand with apparent genuine goodwill and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Haskins," and looked at Matilda with the clear-eyed acceptance of a young man who understands that a situation has resolved itself correctly. That afternoon, Isaac rode into Ridgeton and found the circuit preacher, a thin and energetic man named Reverend Harmon Cole, who was at that moment repairing the church steps with more enthusiasm than skill, and informed him of the plan. Harmon Cole put down his hammer and shook Isaac's hand and said that he would be delighted and that he would be there on the 29th of July without fail. Isaac then went to the dry goods store and spent a somewhat anxious 20 minutes looking at the limited selection of rings, which consisted of a plain gold band and 2 more ornate options that did not look like anything Matilda would want, and bought the plain gold band because it was honest and simple, and those were the 2 qualities he associated with her above all others. He stopped at the livery on his way back because he had been thinking about that horse he had noticed there, a compact, dark bay-cutting horse, 4 years old with a broad chest and intelligent eyes, and he had a conversation with the livery man that ended with a handshake and an arrangement that would come due the following week. He had the $112 in his pocket. The horse cost $85. The ring had cost $6 and some change. He would start the marriage with approximately $20 to his name, plus a good saddle and copper and his rifle and his skills, and the feeling that he was going towards something rather than just enduring something, which was a feeling worth more than the arithmetic. The following 3 weeks were busy in the way that the approach of something significant always makes ordinary things busier, with an urgency in the ordinary tasks that they do not normally carry. The ranch work continued its own schedule regardless of personal developments. The cattle did not adjust their needs to human sentiment, but within the work there was a new quality to everything, a warmth and an openness that had not been present before, because they had named the thing between them and naming had released it from the careful containment of 2 years. They talked differently now. The conversations at the kitchen table were the same subjects: cattle, fence, weather, markets, but there was an additional layer beneath the practical, a current of personal understanding that ran through everything they said, a shorthand built from 2 years of careful observation that now had permission to be direct. He found himself saying things he had thought but not spoken, opinions about the cattle breeding program, ideas for improving the water system in the East pasture, his honest assessment of which sections of fence were going to need full replacement before winter rather than just repair. She received all of it with the engaged attention of a partner who wants to know what the other person actually thinks, and she gave him the same. He learned things about her that the 2 years of professional distance had kept behind a polite screen, that she had been a strong student as a girl and had wanted to be a teacher before her father decided to go west, that she had a dry, quiet humor that she deployed rarely and therefore effectively, that she was genuinely not afraid of Denton Price or anyone like him, and that the fear she did carry was the fear of failure, of losing the land her father had worked, of not being enough to hold it, and that having Isaac beside her in the fullest sense had reduced that fear to something manageable and appropriate rather than the larger thing it had been when she carried it alone. He told her that he had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 boys, and had come west at 18 after his father's farm was absorbed by debt, and that he had spent 4 years working cattle drives before arriving in Kansas, and that in all that time, the thing he had wanted most was a place of his own and a reason to stay in it, and that he had found both and had been too much of a fool to say so until she fixed the situation herself. She received this with characteristic directness. "You're not a fool," she said. "You were being careful. There's a difference. Being careful for 2 years seems like it approaches the foolish end of the spectrum," he said. "Well," she said, and her eyes were bright, "I forgive you for it." He gave her the ring on the evening before the wedding, at the kitchen table after supper, because it was the right place and the right time, and it was their place, the table that had held 2 years of their lives before this and would hold many more after. He had it wrapped in a clean cloth, which he set in front of her and said nothing, and she opened it and looked at the plain gold band and then looked at him with something in her face that he thought was as close to perfect as an expression could be. "It suits you," he said. She put it on her own finger and looked at it for a moment. "It does," she said. "I'll do better by you," he said. "I intend to. The finances are Isaac," she said for approximately the 100th time in the past 3 weeks. "Thin right now," he finished because he needed to say it once clearly and have it out. "I know the finances," she said. "I keep the ledger. We're all right. We're going to be better than all right." She looked at him across the table. "I need you to hear me when I say that. I need you to believe it." "I believe it," he said. "Then stop apologizing for having been a hired hand," she said, with a firmness that was also somehow entirely gentle. "You are the best man I know. That is not a consolation prize. That is the thing I am marrying." He had no answer to that except the one he had found himself with repeatedly in the past 3 weeks, which was to look at her and feel, in a very uncomplicated way, that everything was exactly right. The 29th of July was hot and clear, as July in Kansas generally is. The ceremony was in the church, with Reverend Harmon Cole presiding, and the attendance was better than they had planned. Word had gotten around Ridgeton in the way that news does in small communities, moving through the streets and the stores and the saloons and the livery with the speed and completeness of water. And when the time came, there were perhaps 40 people in the pews of that small church, including Pete Whalen in a clean shirt that was clearly being worn for the first time, and Dale Cutter in the back, and Sheriff Briggs taking up a considerable amount of space in the 3rd row, and various members of the Ridgeton community who had opinions about Matilda Mercer and apparently wanted to witness this particular chapter. She walked up the aisle alone because there was no one to walk with her, and this was the only moment of the day when Isaac felt something close to sadness on her behalf, the absence of Clarence, who should have been there, who would have been there with a straight back and wet eyes and enormous pride. But she walked alone the way she had done everything for 2 years, with a self-possession that was neither coldness nor performance but simply her truest quality. And she came down the aisle in the blue dress she had made for the 4th of July social, with her hair properly arranged, and the morning light coming through the church windows. And she looked at him standing at the front of the church, and her expression, when she found his face, was so straightforward in its happiness that he felt it like a physical thing. Reverend Cole read the words of the ceremony with evident feeling. Isaac and Matilda said theirs, the promises that have been said in churches and under trees and on open ground since time decided that humans needed formality to mark the moments that mattered. And Isaac placed the ring on her finger for the second time, this time in the sight of God and 40 Kansans, and when Harmon Cole said the traditional words, Isaac kissed his wife with a reverence that Pete Whalen described afterward as the most gentlemanly thing he had witnessed in 20 years on the frontier. The reception that followed was the community's contribution. The women of Ridgeton, who had approximately 1 week's warning, had produced a quantity and variety of food that spoke well of their organizational capacity, and there were tables in the churchyard and a fiddle player named Henry Marsh, who played for 3 hours without repeating himself, and with a skill that suggested he had been waiting for an excuse. Isaac danced with his wife, a sentence he turned over in his mind with the wonder of a man holding something new and precious twice, and then a third time during a slow piece that Henry Marsh played with unusual gentleness, and they stood there in the churchyard in the afternoon sun, and he held her with all the honesty he had, and she put her head briefly against his shoulder, and he felt the full weight of what had been built here slowly, without ceremony. Over 2 years of cold mornings and long evenings and fence lines and ledger books and coffee, and all the ordinary things that turn out, upon examination, to be the extraordinary things. They went home to the ranch that evening as the sun was low, with the sky going pink and gold over the prairie and the familiar shape of the house, and the barn against the sky taking on a quality it had not previously had, the quality of being entirely, completely, undisputedly home. That night, with the house quiet and the prairie settled into its summer darkness and the stars enormous overhead, Isaac lay awake for a while and thought about 2 years and about silence, and about the remarkable fact of where silence, properly concluded, could eventually bring a person. He thought about Clarence Mercer, who had hired him and trusted him, and died with a faith in him that he had spent 2 years trying to justify without fully understanding he had already justified it. He thought about Matilda, who was beside him, and that fact alone was enough to render thought nearly inoperative. He told her so. He said very quietly in the dark, "I thought about this for a long time, and it's somehow still better than I imagined." "What is?" she said. She was not asleep. "Being here," he said, "with you." A short silence. "You're going to have to get used to being happy," she said, with the dry precision that he had come to understand was how she expressed the deepest things. "I think I can manage," he said. "Good," she said. "Go to sleep." He went to sleep. The months that followed were the fullest of Isaac's life, which had not been empty before but had been, now that he had this to compare it against, running at perhaps half capacity. He was a different kind of worker with a different kind of stake in the work, and the ranch reflected it. There is a particular energy that comes from building something for yourself and someone you love rather than for wages, and it shows in fences that are sound and water systems that function and cattle that are well managed and a house that is cared for. He and Matilda ran the place as the partners they had always been in practice, and were now in every other sense, their decision-making conversations conducted openly rather than in the careful professional register of employer and employee. He brought ideas, and she brought ideas, and they argued sometimes, in the direct and honest way of people who respect each other's competence, and the arguments were always about the work and always reached a conclusion, and neither of them held them against each other afterward. The cattle herd grew through careful management. By the fall of 1878, they had sold a second group at good prices and reinvested in the breeding stock, and Matilda's ledger showed numbers that were moving steadily in the right direction. They hired a steady hand for the winter, a quiet, experienced man named Carl Morse, who had worked ranches up and down Kansas for 15 years and who fit into the working rhythm of the place without friction. The horse Isaac had bought from the livery in Ridgeton proved out as the cutting horse he had suspected, and he named him Slate, and between Copper and Slate and Sunday they had 3 reliable horses and room in the barn for 2 more when the time came. Denton Price did not return. Sheriff Briggs reported in the fall that Price had turned his attentions to properties further east, toward the Flint Hills, and that Ridgeton was well shut of him. Isaac received this news with equanimity. The land challenge had been defeated, the deed was clean, and the northeast corner of the property was exactly where Clarence Mercer's surveyor had put it in 1872. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard, as Kansas winters frequently are weeks of cold that drove the cattle to the shelter of the draws and tested the soundness of every fence and the warmth of every building. They worked through it together, adding Carl Morse's steady help to their own, and the house was warm and the cattle survived, and by February, when the cold began to ease its grip just slightly, Isaac was able to tell Matilda that they had lost only 2 animals in the whole winter, which was a number that spoke well of how they had prepared. February also brought news that changed the dimensions of their lives. Matilda told him on a quiet Sunday morning while the winter light came through the kitchen windows, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, with the direct honesty that characterized everything about her. She was going to have a child. Isaac was, for approximately 30 seconds, unable to say anything at all. He sat with this extraordinary fact and felt the world rearrange itself around it, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "When?" he said. "August," she said. "Late August, if I've counted correctly." He looked at her hands and then at her face, which was carrying the news with characteristic composure, but also with something underneath the composure that was purely and simply happiness. "Are you?" he started. "I'm well," she said. "I feel well. The nausea has been manageable." She paused. "I want to still work the ranch through the spring and summer reasonably. I know what I can handle." "I know you do," he said. "Don't become overprotective," she said. "I'll try not to," he said, which was the most honest answer he could offer, because the impulse was already significant and he was aware that managing it was going to require some consistent effort. He did reasonably well at it. He adjusted what work Matilda took on without making a production of the adjustment, framing things as convenience rather than caution, finding ways to take the heavier tasks that were reasonable to take without turning her management of her own body into something she had to argue about. She appreciated this, or at least she did not call him out on it more than twice, which by the standards of the agreement he thought was a respectable showing. Spring came with its usual demands and usual beauty, the grass greening up and the cattle moving more easily after the winter, and the ranch was alive with work and plans. They had discussions about the house. The upstairs room that had been Matilda's father's, which they had converted to a study, would need to be changed again, and there were materials to acquire and work to do before August. Isaac converted the room himself, working in the evenings after the ranch day was done, building a crib from good oak he acquired from the mill in Abilene, solid and fitted with the precision of someone who understood that the thing he was building mattered more than anything he had built before. He did not tell Matilda about the crib until it was finished, and when he showed it to her, she stood in the doorway of the room and looked at it for a long time without speaking, and when she turned around her eyes were bright. "Your father taught you to work wood," she said. "And his father before him," Isaac said. "It's beautiful," she said. "It'll hold up," he said. "I know it will," she said. and put her hand on his arm briefly in the way she had that conveyed the full weight of what she meant with the minimum of words, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood there in the room where the crib stood, in the house that had been her father's and was now theirs. And the summer afternoon light came through the window and lay across the floor in a long, warm rectangle, and it was very quiet. The summer of 1879 was fair, neither too wet nor too dry, and the grass was good and the cattle were fat on it, and the ranch work had the particular quality of a machine running well. Carl Morse had become a permanent fixture, a reliable and undemonstrative presence who never required managing, and who had a talent for appearing at exactly the moment when an extra pair of hands was needed. They had taken on a second steady hand for the summer, a young man named Thomas Garrett from south of Wichita who was earnest and quick to learn, and who Carl Morse took under his professional wing with patient efficiency. As August came and the days shortened slightly and the heat reached its peak and then began to ease, Isaac Haskins became a man who slept lightly and listened to the house at night with a constant background attention that he had not previously had occasion to develop. On the evening of August 24, 1879, his wife woke him in the early hours of the morning and said, with her customary steadiness, that it was time. He rode to Ridgeton himself in the dark to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Doris Carr, who was a capable woman of 55 who had been bringing Ridgeton babies into the world for 15 years, and who greeted Isaac's arrival at her door with the unflappable efficiency of long practice. They rode back together, and Mrs. Carr took over the house with professional authority, directing Isaac to the kitchen to boil water and stay out of the way, which he did, though staying out of the way was approximately the hardest physical thing he had done in his life. Carl Morse appeared in the kitchen at some point in the small hours, wordlessly made coffee, and sat at the table with Isaac in the companionable silence of a man who understood that there were times when presence was the only useful thing to offer. They sat together and drank coffee and listened to the house and did not discuss anything in particular, and it was one of the more important silences of Isaac's life. Just after sunrise, in the warm, early light of an August morning, with the meadowlark starting in the grass and the cattle moving toward the creek and the great flat Kansas sky going gold in the east, Doris Carr came to the kitchen door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Haskins." Both doing well. Isaac was in the bedroom approximately 4 seconds later. Matilda was sitting up against the pillows with a look on her face that he had never seen, and that would never entirely leave his memory, tired and entirely present and deeply, fundamentally happy. She was holding a very small, very new person who was wrapped in a white cloth and who was regarding the world with the unfocused attention of someone who has just arrived and is still getting their bearings. "Come here," Matilda said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she placed the child in his arms with careful precision, and he received his son with hands that were not entirely steady, and the child, red-faced and small and astonishingly solid for his size, made a small sound and settled. "He has your chin," Matilda said. Isaac looked at the child's face. "He has your eyes," he said. "He just opened them for the first time," she said. "He may have someone else's eyes entirely. We won't know for a while." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm very well," she said with certainty. "Ask me again in a week and the answer might be more complicated, but right now I'm very well." He looked at his son. He looked at his wife. He thought about Ohio and Missouri and cattle drives and the particular randomness by which a person ends up exactly where they are supposed to be. And he thought about Clarence Mercer, who had stood in a yard and watched a young man handle a spooked horse and made a decision that had led, through a long and winding sequence of ordinary days, to this morning. "Clarence," he said. She looked at him. "If you're willing," he said. "Clarence, for your father." Her eyes went very bright and she did not speak for a moment. "Clarence Isaac Haskins," she said finally, tasting the sound of it. "If you like," he said. "I like," she said, with a fullness in her voice that she did not try to contain. "Very much." Clarence Isaac Haskins came into the world in the late summer of 1879 and proceeded to be, in the estimation of everyone who encountered him, a remarkably good-natured child. He had, as Matilda had predicted, eyes that settled into their color slowly, arriving by his third month at a gray-green that managed to split the difference between both parents, and he had a solidness to him that suggested he intended to be competent at things from the beginning, which Isaac found gratifying and Matilda found completely unsurprising. The ranch entered 1880 in good order, with the herd at its best size since Clarence Mercer had established it, the fences sound, the water system improved by a project Isaac and Carl Morse had completed the previous fall, and the finances showing the steady upward movement that careful management, over time, produces. Isaac and Matilda sat at the kitchen table with the ledger on New Year's Day, with young Clarence asleep in the crib upstairs, and she showed him the numbers and he looked at them and said, "Your father would call this thriving." "I think he would," she said. "What do you want for it?" Isaac asked. "For the ranch, in 5 years." She thought about it seriously, the way she did everything. "A good bull from one of the improved English breeds," she said. "The Shorthorns are serviceable, but there's better bloodlines available now. I want to upgrade the herd over the next few years. And I want to extend the east pasture. There's a section adjacent on the government land survey that's available for claim, and I want to look into it." "I'll look into the claim," he said. "And the house," she said. "I want to add a room on the south side." Before the next she paused. He looked up. She was looking at him with an expression that he had learned by now to read with some precision. "Before the next," he said. She smiled, and the smile was the one that meant she was not going to be able to hold the thing she was feeling inside the ordinary container of a sensible face for much longer. "Before August," she said. He sat with this for approximately 5 seconds and then laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and unguarded, the kind he had not done often enough before she had fixed the situation between them, and she laughed too, and the sound of it filled the kitchen on New Year's Day, 1880, with warmth enough to last the winter. Matilda's prediction proved accurate. The second child, a daughter they named Clara June Haskins, arrived in late August of 1880, with the same general reliability of schedule that suggested Matilda's body approached all things with organizational precision. Clara had her mother's hair and her father's gray eyes, and a disposition that was noticeably more opinionated than her brother's from the very beginning, which Matilda received with equanimity, and Isaac received with the combined love and slight apprehension appropriate to a man who suspected he was going to be regularly outvoted in his own house. By the spring of 1881, the Haskins Ranch, it was still called the Mercer place by most of Ridgeton, from long habit and perhaps affection, and neither Isaac nor Matilda ever pushed to change it, was one of the more successful small cattle operations in that part of central Kansas. They had purchased the adjacent government land claim that Matilda had identified, adding 60 acres of good pasture to the original 160. Carl Morse and Thomas Garrett were both full-time year-round hands now, steady and capable, and integrated into the working life of the ranch with the ease of men who had found a good situation and knew it. Isaac had his horse breeding program started in a small way, with 2 good mares that he had selected carefully over the previous 2 years and slate as the sire. The first foal was a dark bay filly with the compact build and the quality of movement that he had been working toward, and he sold her to a cattleman from Ellsworth for a price that Matilda entered in the ledger with a quietly satisfied expression. In the evenings, the house was full. Clarence, who was 2½ now and deeply invested in everything that happened in his world, had opinions about the horses and the cattle and the chickens and most of the other animals on the property, and he expressed these opinions with the direct and uninhibited certainty of a toddler who has been consistently taken seriously by 2 adults who love him. Clara, at 8 months, was discovering that the world was full of interesting objects, and that reaching toward them produced results. And she and her father had a running game that consisted primarily of him presenting various safe items within her reach and observing what she made of them, which Matilda watched with an expression of amused affection. On a May evening in 1881, with the supper things cleared and Clarence asleep and Clara settled in the crib that had held her brother before her, Isaac and Matilda sat on the porch of the house in the long evening light, which was one of the great gifts of the Kansas spring. The slow, golden, enormous evenings that seemed to last longer than evenings anywhere else. She had a cup of coffee and he had a glass of water, and Copper and Sunday were visible in the near pasture, grazing in the last of the light. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He looked at her. "The horse program," he said, and then, "and this." "This," she repeated. "All of it," he said. "Where we are." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about the morning you asked me. Were you embarrassed?" she said, and her voice had the warmth of a woman who has been privately amused by a specific memory for 3 years. "Enormously," he said. "I nearly came off the horse." "You very nearly did," she agreed. "If you had waited 2 more weeks," he said, "I was going to ask you myself." She looked at him with that particular green-eyed directness. "Were you?" "I had it planned out," he said. "I had the whole thing arranged in my head." "What were you going to say?" she asked. He thought about it. "Something about the ranch," he said. "About how I wanted to keep building it and how I couldn't imagine doing it with anyone else and how I understood that I didn't come to the conversation with Isaac," she said. "The financial standing that Isaac—" He stopped. "I'm glad I asked first," she said. He looked at her. "So am I," he said, and meant it absolutely. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. And they sat like that in the long May evening with the horses in the pasture, and the cattle moving somewhere in the distance, and the children asleep in the house behind them, and the whole of the country spread out before them in the golden light. The great flat land that had tested Clarence Mercer and kept him, and that had found Isaac Haskins and made a place for him. And that belonged now to both of them, and to the children sleeping behind the walls that stood on ground that had been won with hard work and quiet love, and eventually, a very direct question on a spring morning beside a north fence line. The sun went down and the stars came out, and the nightjar called from near the creek, the same sound he had heard on so many evenings from the bunkhouse across the yard, a different man then in a different situation, and now here on this porch, with this woman's hand in his and the whole of a built life arranged around him in the warm dark. "I love you," he said. He said it easily now. It had taken him 2 years to say it the first time, and now it came as naturally as breathing. "I know," she said, and her voice was warm and sure and entirely certain. "I love you too." She had always said it back since the first time, without hesitation, with the same directness she brought to all things, as if the feeling were simply a fact to be stated clearly and she saw no reason to be coy about it. He had never tired of hearing it. He suspected he never would. The ranch went on. The seasons turned over it with the reliable generosity and occasional cruelty of the Kansas climate, and Isaac and Matilda Haskins met each season with the combined capacity of 2 people who had grown up understanding that hard things could be endured and good things could be built, and that the difference between enduring and building was, in the end, the difference between going through a life alone and going through it with someone who saw you clearly and chose you anyway. Clarence grew into a serious, capable boy, with a gift for the horses that was evident before he was 4 years old. Clara grew into a force of personal conviction that showed itself first in her opinions about what she would and would not eat, and later in opinions about larger things. And she was her mother's daughter in the completeness of her self-possession and her father's in the patience with which she watched the world before she acted on it. 3 years after Clara, in the spring of 1884, there was a third child, another boy, born in March with a spring storm howling over the plains and Doris Carr at the house again, and Carl Morse at the kitchen table again, with Isaac drinking coffee in the pre-dawn. while Thomas Garrett took the pre-dawn ranch watch with a horse blanket and philosophical stoicism. This child they named Owen, after Isaac's father, and he arrived looking already like a person with strong opinions about the world. And he was not wrong to have them, because the world he had come into was one that his parents had built with deliberate care and a great deal of love. The Mercer place by 1885 was a working ranch of 220 acres, with a good solid herd and a horse breeding program that had developed enough of a reputation in central Kansas that buyers came to them rather than the other way around. The house had the additional room Matilda had planned, and another one after it, and the barn had been expanded twice. There were 4 horses in steady work, 6 in the breeding program, and Isaac had added a small but functional forge behind the barn where he could work metal when the long winter days offered the time. He had thought once that he was a man without a place. He had been wrong. The place had been here all along, waiting for him to stop being careful enough to claim it. On the last evening of September, 1885, with the autumn coming on and the first real cold arriving in the night air, and the trees along the creek gone gold and the cattle fat from the summer grass, Isaac Haskins sat on the porch of his house and watched his children play in the yard in the last light. Clarence was 6, brown and serious, conducting some careful investigation of a beetle near the fence post. Clara was 5, bright and purposeful, having a conversation with Sunday through the pasture fence that the horse appeared to be following with genuine interest. Owen was 1.5, sitting in the dirt in a posture of complete satisfaction, doing nothing in particular and clearly finding it sufficient. Matilda came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him. They watched their children in the evening light. "I was counting," he said. "What were you counting?" she asked. "It's been 9 years since your father hired me," he said, "nearly to the month." She was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't feel like 9 years," she said. "Parts of it felt long," he said. "The first 2 years," she said. "Yes," he said. "Those." She handed him his coffee. "And now," she said. He looked at the yard, at his children in the September light, at the house that was full and warm, at the pasture where the horses grazed and the sky above it going pink and gold. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the direct and comfortable regard of a woman who knows the person she is looking at absolutely, with no remaining uncertainty in either direction, and who has arrived at a place in her own life that matches what she had always understood herself to deserve. "Now it feels like not enough," he said. "I want more of it." She smiled, the full, unguarded smile that he had first seen in its entirety on the morning she asked him a question beside a fence line and he had nearly fallen off his horse, and he was still, after everything, affected by it in a way that he accepted would never change and had no desire to alter. "Then we'll make more of it," she said. He took her hand. The evening settled over the ranch, over the grass and the cattle and the horses and the children and the house and the 2 people on the porch, with the particular generosity of a September evening on the Kansas plains, where the light is long and the sky is enormous and the world feels, if you have built something in it that is genuinely yours, like it has arranged itself especially for you, even though you know it has not, even though you know it is indifferent and large and hard and beautiful, and that the particular arrangement of your life within it is a thing you made yourself out of silence and courage and daily work and love that was spoken, eventually, in the best possible way. Suddenly, honestly, in the morning sun beside a north fence line, by a woman who knew her own mind, to a man who had always known his heart and had only needed the right question to finally, fully open it.